and that we take good note of what they're saying. So it's not as if what the Secretary of Commerce has mentioned.
America struck first, but the blow backfired. When the White House announced that it would bring jobs back home, it seemed that North America was on the verge of a new economic order. Washington wanted to bring Canada to its knees. The auto industry, steel, aluminum, the entire trading system that had sustained joint industry for decades was suddenly under threat.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures.
American tariffs were supposed to force Canadian companies to move production south. Instead, the U.S.'s own supply chains began to collapse. Hundreds of thousands of American workers suddenly felt that the price of economic patriotism was higher than they had expected. While Washington was chanting slogans about a great industrial revival, Ottawa was taking a different approach. Without loud statements, without tweets, without ostentatious gestures, Canada did what even its allies in Europe failed to do. It responded precisely and coolly. Instead of arguing with the White House, it began to rebuild its market. Tariffs became an incentive. Pressure turned into opportunity.
We compete. There are areas where we compete, and it's in those areas where we have to come to an agreement that works. But there are more areas where we are stronger together, and that's what we're focused on. And we're going to get the right deal. Right deal for America, right deal, obviously, from my perspective, for Canada.
Behind the scenes, the Prime Minister and his team began to strengthen the country's foundations, investments in critical minerals, battery production, automotive industry support programs, countermeasures against tariffs, but without destroying relations. Not confrontation, but strategic restraint. And the result was not long in coming. The American economy began to struggle. Car factories in Michigan and Ohio began to complain about a shortage of parts, rising prices, and delivery delays. In Canada, on the contrary, new jobs, new investments, and new partnerships appeared. The America First policy unexpectedly made Canada stronger. But the real climax came when the two leaders met in the Oval Office. The cameras showed smiles and handshakes, but behind them lay a struggle not for trade, but for influence. One leader spoke in slogans and figures that did not exist. The other responded with facts. And the longer the press conference lasted, the more noticeable the difference between confidence and confusion became.
Really build on that relationship, and I think that's why the outcome this week was a positive one. Well, we know that no deal has been struck. We know that negotiations are going ahead in the right direction.
Canada did not win by force, it won by discipline. Today, as the tariff war enters a new phase, the stakes are getting even higher. Washington is raising tariffs again now, not only on metal and cars, but also on furniture, wood, and even food. And Canada is responding not with threats, but with laws that make its system almost untouchable. And now a new battlefield. Immigration. The White House is introducing a $100,000 fee for H-1 billion work visas. For American industry, this should be a shield, but for Canada, it is a window of opportunity. After all, now the best engineers, programmers, and scientists are choosing Toronto over California. Not Silicon Valley, but Waterloo.
Well, when U.S. officials talk, we need to make sure that we listen.
The economic battle between the U.S. and Canada has turned into a story about who can learn from crises and who can create them. And, perhaps for the first time in decades, the northern neighbor is one step ahead. This is not just a dispute over tariffs. It is a struggle for the future of North America. And it has already begun. In the spring of 2025, clouds were gathering over the North American economy. Washington announced a new wave of tariffs, which, according to the White House, were intended to restore fairness and bring manufacturing back home. But behind the loud slogans lay a simple goal: to force Canada to give in. The automotive industry, the heart of the continent's industrial belt, was the first target. The U.S. Secretary of Commerce declared in Toronto that America must be first and Canada second. To Canadians, this sounded like a challenge, a warning that decades of integration and interdependence could be undone by a single political decision.
They don't allow our banks, and you know that Canada does not allow banks to go in.
As a result of these developments, the breadth and the depth of the changes in U.S. trade policy have become more fully apparent.
For the first time in a long time, US trade rhetoric no longer sounded like partnership and began to resemble dictation. The White House believed that the threat would force Canadian manufacturers to shut down production in Ontario and move it to Michigan and Ohio. But the North American economy is not a board where you can simply move pieces around. It is a web of supply chains, technologies, logistics, and labor that has been built up over decades. And when the US pulled on one thread, others began to fray. In Ontario, the news of the American move prompted an immediate reaction. The provincial premier said that such statements were a stab in the back from an ally, and that Canada had no intention of obeying someone else's rules. However, Ottawa decided not to respond with public threats. They understood that loud rhetoric would only play into the hands of Washington, which was eager for political conflict. Instead, quiet but systematic work began. Analytical groups at the Ministry of Finance and Industry worked around the clock to model scenarios, which industries would be the first to suffer, where exports could be redirected, and which domestic programs could soften the blow.
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
Meanwhile, the White House insisted that Canada would break first. But within a few weeks, it became clear that the situation was developing differently. American car factories began to complain about interruptions in the supply of parts. Canada is the largest supplier of components for car assembly in the US, and even temporary disruptions in supply led to the shutdown of assembly lines. The paradox was that the tariffs introduced to protect American industry began to stifle it from within. According to the Canadian Automobile Manufacturers Association, more than half of the components used in Ontario factories come from the US. Every car that rolls off the assembly line in Windsor or Oshawa is the result of the joint efforts of engineers and workers on both sides of the border. Breaking this link would mean a blow not only to Canada, but also to the United States itself. Washington understood this, but too late. By the time the first reports of falling production reached Congress, the domino effect had already begun.
Those were quickly followed by reciprocal tariffs on every U.S. trade partner and very high sectoral tariffs applied globally on strategic industries, including steel, aluminum, autos, and copper.
The situation remained tense in Quebec and Alberta, but the Canadian government seized the moment to strengthen its position. Behind closed doors, a strategic industrial stabilization plan was developed, a document that included hidden tax incentives, support for exporters, and a compensation program for companies that kept production within the country. The program was unofficially named the Northern Shield. It provided temporary tariff concessions, but only for those companies that did not move jobs abroad. At the same time, Ottawa was actively negotiating with European and Asian partners, opening up new sales channels. In London and Seoul, initiatives suddenly appeared to purchase Canadian battery modules and lithium components, the very ones that had previously been supplied to the United States. All this happened without any loud announcements. At press conferences, the Prime Minister spoke only of restructuring national priorities, but within the government, they understood that a real economic counterattack was underway.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs that cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
Meanwhile, Washington was faced with the fact that American companies had begun to unofficially lobby for tariff relief. Major automakers warned that additional duties on components from Canada would lead to an 8 to 10% increase in car prices. Independent economists estimated the total losses for the American side at $180 billion by 2028. Even the administration's allies began to recognize that the pressure tactic was not working. Amid this tension, the reaction of Canadian society was surprisingly unified. Whereas trade with the US had previously been a source of controversy between provinces, a rare consensus had now formed around the issue. Rallies in support of economic sovereignty were held in Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver. Posters with slogans such as "Made in Canada" means reliable became a symbol of new confidence. The media wrote that for the first time in decades, the country had stopped seeing itself as the junior partner in the alliance. Other processes were unfolding in parallel. the Canadian government established a $2 billion fund to support automakers, which included both direct grants and loans on favorable terms. As part of the Auto 2030 program, new factories began to be built to produce batteries and components for electric vehicles. These investments created thousands of jobs and allowed companies to maintain production despite U.S. tariffs.
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
But perhaps the most important element of the strategy was diplomacy. Canada did not publicly accuse the U.S., preferring to act through private negotiations. Weekly meetings between Canadian representatives and American governors, senators, and members of Congress gradually changed the tone of the discussion in Washington. There, they began to understand that Canada was not an enemy or a rival, but part of a common economic ecosystem. Meanwhile, the White House continued its rhetoric about America's trade recovery, even though internal reports showed that the country's industry was beginning to stall. By midsummer, it became clear that the tariff attack had brought Washington neither new jobs nor investment growth. On the contrary, American consumers faced rising prices for cars and household appliances. Newspapers wrote about tariff inflation, a phenomenon where attempts to protect the domestic market become a source of price increases. Meanwhile, in Canada, there was a growing sense that the country had passed the test. Economists noted that instead of falling, industrial production had grown by 3%, and the unemployment rate in Ontario had fallen to its lowest level in a decade. New contracts with Europe and Asia partially offset the loss of the American market.
And Canada's been tough on the military because they have a very low military cost.
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
The White House continued to pretend that it was in control of the situation, but even within the U.S., analysts began to talk about a strategic miscalculation. One report by the Brookings Institution called what was happening the self-strangulation of industrial policy. It noted that Washington was trying to rebuild the system without understanding that it already works in its favor. This marked the end of the first stage of the trade confrontation. The U.S. expected a quick capitulation, but instead got a mirror effect. The harder it pressed, the more resilient Canada became. The country, which many had come to regard as dependent on its southern neighbor, managed to turn the crisis into a catalyst for growth. And when it seemed that the conflict had reached its peak, Ottawa took the next step. It began to form a new economic architecture, where the focus was not on defense, but on adaptation.
I spoke to Governor Trudeau on numerous occasions, and we'll see what happens, but it just sets up so good for them. Look, the people would pay much less tax than they're paying right now. They'd have perfect military protection.
Canada's strategy is not a story of victory in the tariff battle. It is a story of how a small country, without superpower status, can turn vulnerability into an instrument of strength. When the economy is built on interdependence, threats become opportunities. And that was the main lesson learned at the beginning of the trade confrontation with the United States. While Washington was discussing the next round of tariffs, Ottawa was already working on something much bigger than just retaliatory measures. Canada understood that economic defense is not only protection against external pressure, but also a chance to rebuild its entire industrial policy model. After the first blows of the tariff war, the government launched a large-scale reform, which was referred to behind the scenes as the new industrial map. Its essence was not to survive, but to become more independent from American supply chains and turn dependence into a tool of influence. While the US was loudly proclaiming the return of jobs, Canada was doing so quietly but consistently. The Strategic Industrial Adaptation Program combined federal and provincial funding, directing billions of dollars to the development of critical industries, from lithium and nickel processing to the production of batteries for electric vehicles. The Ministry of Natural Resources published a draft report stating that by 2030, the country will be able to meet at least 40% of domestic demand for key EV components, a figure that even the largest powers have not been able to achieve before.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
This was not just about economics. It was a cold calculation. The government understood that the future of global industry was shifting toward green technologies, and if Washington decided to close its supply chains within the country, Ottawa would bet on becoming a source of raw materials and technologies without which no American factory could operate. It was during this period that Canada began to use the term defense integration, a strategy in which key industries become so interdependent that any attempts to exert pressure become meaningless. Decisions were made with almost no public debate. One industry department official later told reporters that all meetings were held under the heading confidential, and documents with export route forecasts were marked for internal use only. These materials included plans to build new logistics hubs along the Trans-Canada Highway and agreements with ports on the East Coast to ensure the rapid delivery of batteries and rare earth materials to Europe. At the same time, negotiations were underway with major car manufacturers. Volkswagen and Stellantis confirmed plans to build factories in Canada despite US tariffs. Japanese and South Korean companies also sent delegations to Ottawa to discuss long-term investments. Some of the negotiations were held behind closed doors, and the press only learned about them several months later. One of the participants in these meetings later admitted that Canada was offering not just financial incentives, but guarantees of access to clean energy, a factor that was decisive for companies seeking to reduce their carbon footprint.
In fact, the average U.S. tariff rate on the world has jumped from just over 2% at the end of last year to almost 16%, 8 times higher. 16% currently.
While industry was restructuring, diplomacy was working just as effectively. Canada acted as a partner, not an opponent, even when Washington openly showed its irritation. Representatives from Ottawa visited the U.S. Capitol weekly, meeting with governors of industrial states and members of Congress. At these meetings, the Canadians did not make threats, but simply reminded their counterparts of the facts that Canada buys more American cars than any other country, and that thousands of jobs in Detroit and Toledo depend on parts supplied from Windsor and Oshawa. These figures were more convincing than any slogans.
As in previous trade disputes, Canada has implemented a series of retaliatory tariffs. Their objectives have been to protect Canadian workers and businesses and to incentivize a negotiated settlement with the United States. Few other countries followed suit.
But the real demonstration of the contrast between the two countries' approaches came later, during a meeting in the Oval Office. The cameras broadcast the usual picture of diplomatic dialogue, flags, smiles, exchanges of pleasantries. However, beneath the surface of this scene, something else was going on. On one side was the American president, eager to prove that his strategy was working. On the other was the Canadian Prime Minister, calm, confident, and seemingly knowing in advance how the conversation would end. From the very beginning of the press conference, it was clear who was in control of the situation. The American leader spoke of billions in new investment and the greatest economic revival, but the figures he cited did not match either the data from the Department of Commerce or the reports from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. Journalists who knew the statistics exchanged glances but postponed their questions. They were interested to see how the Canadian side would behave. When it was her turn to speak, the Prime Minister gave a short speech in which there was not a single superfluous phrase. He reminded everyone that Canada remains the largest investor in the American economy, that half of all parts for cars assembled in the US come from Canadian factories, and that tariffs do not protect production, but make it more expensive.
Economic force, because Canada and the United States, that would really be something. So I think Canada is going to be a very serious contender to be our 51st state.
At that moment, the contrast became obvious even to those watching the meeting on television. The president tried to laugh it off, but his words sounded less and less confident. He jumped from topic to topic, from trade to crime, from investment to fishing, even mentioning the fight against drug cartels in the Caribbean. The meaning was lost, while the Canadian leader standing next to him remained unperturbed. When a journalist asked why there was no new trade agreement if relations between the countries were so good, the president replied, "Because I want to be great too." There was laughter in the room, but it was nervous. After the meeting, American television channels discussed not the content of the negotiations, but the manner of communication itself. Commentators noted that for the first time in many years, the US president did not look like the master of the stage, but a participant in someone else's performance. The Canadian press, in turn, wrote about silent diplomacy and how the country managed to turn political weakness into an instrument of strength. But behind the outward politeness lay a serious political line. Canada was already using summit meetings as a means of informational pressure. Each diplomatic visit was accompanied by a series of publications in the business media, where experts emphasized the interdependence of the two economies. This shaped public opinion in the United States itself. More and more American analysts began to doubt that the tariff war made sense.